Welcome to hour 2 of Jay's analysis, where we will continue with the full presentation of what I wanted to discuss in the debate and didn't get to, as well as basics of logical fallacies. Now, a lot of these are going to become pretty intuitive when you start getting used to the informal fallacies. And you don't actually have to, the more knowledge that you have, the better, but you don't have to have an advanced understanding necessarily of, really obtuse logical problems. But it is good to know basic things like this, because these are the kinds of things that you're going to encounter in a lot of normative discourse. And you'll notice that if it's something like a politician speaking, or a newscast, or talking heads debating on TV, or in maybe talk radio, these happen all the time. And that's why we have the domain of formal debates, is because the parties, hopefully, are agreeing to the acceptance of the laws of logic and rationality, reasoning, and so forth. So informal fallacies constitute fallacies in formal debates or in normative discourse. Now, when I was debating with JF, we weren't just discussing fallacies. In fact, we didn't really touch on that. The essence of the debate was actually a meta-logical question that I raised about number theory and the status, or the ontological status, of abstract concepts, numbers, logical laws, etc. But it's probably a little more helpful to people studying and trying to learn, which is why probably you subscribe to Jay's analysis after we did all the Plato lectures and we did the Tragedy and Hope lectures, and we've done a lot of theological lectures and interviews. So this is going to be helpful, I think, to give a kind of basics as it pertains to logic. Now, everybody may be familiar with this page that's gone around. It's kind of a standard list of the informal fallacies, and it is helpful. However, whoever put this together obviously has some kind of atheistic bias, which is kind of ridiculous, because they have Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, who weren't really atheists. So it's almost like a Hillary supporter did the examples. So the list itself is good, though, and it's helpful for learning, but the examples that they give are pretty bad, and in fact they don't usually work. So I'm going to maybe give better examples, but I do like this list. Now, the first kind of logical problem that we see that happens a lot in formal fallacy is a straw man. And as this says, it's misrepresenting someone's argument to make it easier to attack. It's not always necessarily misrepresenting. It may actually be completely different. Like, I didn't even make that argument. If I were to say, I'm here to argue objectively that God exists. And in fact, people that were commenting on the debate and in the chat and whatnot, they did throw in some straw men. For example, many people who were critical, which was actually the minority, but many of the critics of the debate said, this guy is arguing that because I can prove logic, God exists. I didn't exactly really make that argument. That's not a good phrasing or statement. So it's kind of a misrepresentation. Maybe a better example of a straw man would be, Jay thinks that because he's read his Bible, that proves God exists. Right? That would be a straw man. That's not the argument that I made. Or something like, Jay thinks that the cosmological argument proves that God exists. No, I did not make the cosmological argument. And I don't think the cosmological argument, as it's classically formulated, works. So those would be examples of straw men. I'm not even going to use their dumb example. But yeah, this is one that comes up a lot. You will see in a debate or in a discussion, and these don't just apply to debates. If you're in business, you need to know these things, because these are bad reasonings that might, convince something or somebody of a bad move in business. If you're a coach, you know what I mean? Somebody might give a bad argument for why play XYZ should be executed, and this is actually going to be detrimental to the team. So knowing bad reasoning isn't something confined to blood sport debates on YouTube or something like that, or the academic realm. It's actually applicable to everyday living. And the better you are as a reasoner, as an effective communicator and debater, the better that you will be in whatever your profession is. They are also useful for something like sales. If you're in sales, it's very helpful to know these things, because if you can, in a nice way, persuade someone rhetorically that they're incorrect, obviously you're going to make more sales. So this is very useful just in the human domain overall. And you're not really taught this. I mean, yeah, probably if you take, like Logic 101 or, basic logic class, you'll have this stuff. But a lot of people go through their entire academic career, and even into, as I've said many times, even into graduate realm, they even get a PhD, and they've never had a logic class. This is why so many people, go on debates and they go on TV and they're whatever, and they make these terrible arguments that are fallacious. Now, of course, sometimes that's because they don't care about logical laws or logic, and they're actually just, trying to make a scene or a spectacle, in which case, that's not the domain of, that's the domain of entertainment and drama, not the domain of actual formal argumentation. But we all intuitively know these things are wrong. And this is what I think is very fascinating, is that these aren't just abstract concepts. They kind of intuitively make sense. And that I think shows their universality. We intuitively know that, hey, wait, there's something wrong about you using a straw man argument, right? It's not right for you to falsely portray my argument. And there's something just inherently wrong. It's a violation of some kind of law, namely the laws of logic, obviously, for you to construct my position as something that it's not. So you can't do that. That's not allowed. False cause. This is a good one. This one is also very common, and they list it as presuming that a real or perceived relationship between things means that one is the cause of the other. It's sometimes called the genetic fallacy. And the idea that, let's see what their example is. Pointed to a fancy chart, Roger shows how temperatures have been rising over the past few centuries, while at the same time the number of pirates have been decreasing. So pirates cool the world, and global warming is a hoax. So this atheist Hillary supporter that put this list together cleverly constructed their example to actually make critics of global warming look like they're fallacious. No, actually, and I mean, in this example, yes, that would be a fallacy. But and also, there was a great correlation is not causation example that I found on a website. I can't remember where it was, but somebody put together a bunch of funny charts where it was very similar lines on a graph to unrelated things. And so one of them was like, rise in, I don't know, sea levels or something stupid. And then the other one was numbers of films that Nicolas Cage appeared in each year. And the graphs are almost perfectly the same. So the joke was that Nicolas Cage movies are actually causing a rise in sea levels. So that would be a false correlation or a false cause. An example of this might be this dumb argument that some people make that, religion is I've seen people take mushrooms who think that they see deities and spirits and demons. So that must be where Moses got his revelation at Mount Sinai. And so, this is like the John Allegro thesis. So that's how religion comes. The Bible is a book that comes from people taking mushrooms. That's a false cause. First of all, there's no evidence that Moses was doing shrooms in the desert. And there's no evidence that the God that Moses came up with is in any way similar to the kind of deity, quote unquote, or pantheism that most people who do acid or shrooms think they've discovered. So false cause, great examples there. Slippery slope, this is very common. Actually, let's do ad hominem because this is the most common. Very obvious. An ad hominem is against the man, right? And this is where we have a situation where you basically, if you're making a point, and I'm sure everybody has experienced it. We've all experienced an ad hominem, maybe not even in the context of a debate, but something like the workplace where, maybe somebody accuses you in the workplace of stealing. And when they're arguing this to the manager or HR or whoever, and they're like, well, he's been on Twitter saying mean stuff before, so he probably stole from the company pot or whatever. Right? He stole from the register because I saw him saying some pretty mean shit on Twitter one time. Well, that would be an ad hominem, right? So you saying something mean on Twitter really doesn't have any direct connection. It's a non sequitur to say. It doesn't, in other words, in logic, that means it doesn't follow. It doesn't follow from the fact that you said something mean on Twitter that therefore you are objectively proven guilty of being the guy who stole $5 from the register. Right? So that would be an ad hominem even outside of the context of a debate. In a debate, as I said in the first 2 hours of this talk, something obvious would be, Jay believes that Jay broke up with a girl and he was mean to her a couple years ago, so I don't have to believe any of his arguments. Right, so you can bring all these logical arguments at me, Jay, but you're a piece of shit because you broke up with your girlfriend 2 years ago and she didn't do anything wrong. Right, that would be an ad hominem. If Bill Cosby said 2 + 2 is 4, right, something like this, zeeble dobble, zeeble dobble. If Bill Cosby said 2 + 2 is 4, and someone said, Bill Cosby, I don't have to accept your mathematical principles because you drugged women. That would be an ad hominem. Slippery slope. They say, asserting that if we allow A to happen, then Z will consequently happen too, and therefore A should not happen. JF kind of verged on this a little bit towards the end of the debate, where he said something like, if we allow religion or when religion propagates, we get people who don't really follow the universal principles that they claim. People don't follow logic and rules of debate and rules of morality. And what we end up with is hypocrites and priests who want to molest children. And that's kind of a slippery slope because, it really doesn't follow that because we're allowing and propagating religion that necessarily the molestation of children will happen, right? This doesn't follow. Now, depending on what the religion is, I mean, if the religion advocates molestation, then yeah, that it would lead to that. But it doesn't follow that because of if we allow one, then the other, because it's not always necessarily the case that B will follow A, right? I mean, sometimes B might follow A, but the fact that B has at times followed A doesn't necessarily mean that B will always follow A. Let's see what their example is. Colin Closet asserts that if we allow same-sex couples to marry, then the next thing we know we'll be allowing people to marry their parents, their cars, and even monkeys. Well, guess what? That actually wasn't a slippery slope. And so this is another leftist example. SJW, whatever SJW put together their list here, is incorrect. In this case, the reason that their example is not a slippery slope is because that we can actually show that certain moral actions do follow from a society given over to relativism. So I don't agree with their example. Special pleading. This is interesting because at one point JF tried to, not in the actual debate, but when I first came on Warski Stream, and we had about a 30-minute kind of rough discussion of what we would like to debate, you might say, of what we would debate. And he said something like I was using special pleading because of, I don't even remember what it was, something to do with theism or something. I don't know, but actually a better example of special pleading or moving the goalposts would be the uniformitarian principle that most naturalists assume. And this is the idea that the natural world has always operated in exactly the same way as it does now. So they will say this when it comes to things like radiometric dating. The decay rate has always been the same to get the results that they think prove billions of years. They will say uniformitarianism when it comes to light refraction and trying to date the universe based on starlight measurements, so forth, right? This has to be uniform to come to their conclusions. However, they will engage in special pleading when, and I've seen JF do this in actual debates, when the discussion comes up of the length, the distance of the moon from the Earth. And the argument is made that if the moon is actually moving away from the Earth a little bit each year, if we assume uniformitarianism, then the moon hits the Earth very soon. In other words, if we go back in time and scoot the moon, an inch closer to Earth, it would have hit the Earth fairly quickly in the scheme that they have. Right? And so, in other words, they don't want, and JF actually said this, I do not assume uniformitarianism when it comes to the rate of moon movement away from the Earth. And then in other cases, yes, we must assume uniformitarianism in the geologic record. So those are examples of special pleading. I do agree with this example. This example here, Edward Johns claimed that he was psychic, but when his abilities were tested under scientific conditions, suddenly they disappeared. Edward explained that everybody had to have faith in his abilities for them to actually work. There's a funny X-Files. It might be the one that's Clyde Bruckman's Repose, I think. But there's this scene at the beginning that's pretty funny with this psychic, the amazing Yippee, who appears in a couple X-Files episodes, and he shows up, and he's the fake Hollywood psychic, and then the Clyde Bruckman character is actually the guy with psychic abilities, who's very humble and innocuous. And the showboat amazing Yippee comes in, and he gets a few things right in reading the room about a murder, and then he gets something wrong, and he looks at Mulder or Scully, or it's probably Scully because she's the skeptic, and he says something like, well, my abilities don't work when somebody in the room doesn't believe. So, great example of special pleading. Loaded question is a good one. It doesn't always come, but every now and then, especially in a debate, or if you watch when somebody's trying to destroy somebody in a TV interview or radio interview or something like this, a highly publicized interview, like when Roosh V went on Dr. Oz. There were a lot of loaded questions from Dr. Oz, and the loaded questions were actually intended to give the impression that no matter how Roosh answered the questions, he ended up looking like a jerk. Now, whatever you think of Roosh. And I would say if whether you like him or not, if you watch the interview, which is I think on Vimeo, I don't know if it's on YouTube anymore, but you'll notice that the questions that Dr. Oz asks are consistently loaded questions. And Roosh doesn't actually stop to say, hey, wait a minute, that's not a fair question, right? And I'm not faulting him for that, because he was obviously nervous, and who wouldn't be in front of, millions of people, millions of women, housewives, basically. But the questions were emotionally laced, and they were loaded. Let's see what example they give. Grace and Helen were both romantically interested in Brad. One day, Brad was sitting in earshot. Grace asked in an inquisitive tone whether Helen was having problems with her fungal infections. Yeah, a better example, that was a dumb example, but a better one would be, are you still beating your wife? If you say no, then it implies that at one time you were beating your wife. If you say yes, then you're even worse, right? You're a total piece of crap. But really, the question is itself the ultimate. That is the ultimate version of the loaded question. There's a lot of different ones. Let me think. The one that Dr. Oz asked is really funny to Roosh was, what in your past happened to make you hate women so much? Now, that was like the first or second opening. That was like the opening question, or like the second one. Now, again, maybe Roosh, had something in his past that makes him have a certain view towards women. Regardless, that question is a loaded question, because first of all, we haven't actually demonstrated that something in the past actually did happen to cause Roosh to be this way. It's assumed at the outset. And the question is framed to where Roosh is going to immediately from the outset be on the defensive. So it's not just a fallacy; it's also kind of a trick to psychologically kind of destabilize and kind of have the opponent off balanced in the debate. And so rather than being on the defensive and being off balanced when somebody throws a loaded question, what you need to do is question the loaded question. So wait a minute. This is a loaded question. And then illustrate how it's a loaded question. You're saying, wait a minute, this question is not a fair question. You're from the outset trying to get me to do X, Y, Z. Gambler's fallacy. This is an interesting one, and this is also similar to the correlation is not always causation. Believing that runs occur in statistic information, believing that runs occur to statistically independent phenomena such as roulette wheel spins. Red had come up 6 times now in the roulette wheel, so Greg knew that it was close to certain that black would be next up. Suffering from an economic form of natural selection with this thinking, he soon lost all of his savings. Again, here we have this sort of atheistic Hillary Dawkins atheism, where because this person made a flaw in their reasoning, this was somehow a manifestation of Darwinian natural selection weeding this person out of the breeding pool, the gene pool. Utterly ridiculous example there, but by the way, that's a non sequitur, which is another fallacy. It doesn't follow from the fact that because someone made an error in their reasoning that they are therefore destined to be weeded out of the gene pool. I mean, this is preposterous. But this does happen, right? Sometimes you'll see people cherry picking something, data or statistics, and we don't always know the origin of these data and statistics. You see this a lot in news interviews where people will say, a recent study of the last 5 years of social justice on campus showed that there has been a rise in white people hate crimes. And you ask, what is the rise? And they'll say, Elliot Rodgers, or like the SPLC recently saying that Elliot Rodgers and all these bizarre cases, like some fat Democratic dude, Zimmerman or something, like these are alt-right killings. that could be an example of gambler's fallacy, right? Where we are cherry picking the information. We're assuming that all of these events have some sort of connection as being the exact same, and that therefore the next thing that will happen, the next shooting has to be white supremacist because all the other shootings were white supremacist. No, come on. Bandwagon fallacy. Appealing to popularity or the fact that many people do something as an attempt or form of validation. Boy, don't the atheists and the Darwinists do this one all the time. Absolutely. Evolution is a freaking dogmatic fact, man. They've proven it in like 1 million studies in every university. Like the smartest people are atheists, like Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins. Like come on, like everybody admits this. Like they proved it. Like they proved it in studies, dude. That's kind of how, your basic bitch normie guy talks, right, about atheism. The guy on the street talks about Darwinism. That's actually just a bandwagon fallacy. It doesn't matter how many people believe something. 99.9% of the world can believe something and it's false. It has nothing to do with the objective truth or falsity of the position or the claim. That one should be really obvious, but a little less common in debates because people tend to be kind of leery of the more obvious fallacies in debates like bandwagon or ad hominem. Those are very, very common, very obvious. Ad hominem, right? Straw man and bandwagon. Those are probably the most common. Let's move to the next one here. Black or white. This is a common one. This is sometimes called the false either or dichotomy. And really, this is just kind of a rejection of nuance, right? It's an assumption of some very difficult or abstract or obscure case being boiled down to an oversimplification. Their example is, while rallying support for his plan to fundamentally undermine citizens' rights, the supreme dictator said that told the people that they were either on his side or on the side of the enemy. Best example of this, very similar to this, is you're either with us or with the terrorists. You're either with us or with the terrorists. Really, George, isn't that kind of an either or fallacy there? I mean, is all of life really just broken down into you're with America or you're a terrorist? Come on. What about the fact that we question the whole neoconservative game plan, and we think that you may have actually benefited and been involved, you and the whole neocon crew, in 9/11. So no, we don't accept your either or fallacy. Begging the question. Now this one is very common. There was a guy just now arguing with me on YouTube on my analysis, hour one of this talk, or excuse me, the first couple hours of this talk, analyzing the debate with JF. And they were saying, why does information have to be meaningful? Can't one mind just convey information to another mind? And because they were asking, why did I keep making the point about chemicals in one guy's head being different from chemicals in another guy's head? And I was saying, well, because they're different chemicals. So once you try to make meaning physical, once you have this reductionistic naturalistic materialism view, you have a problem for how meaning can be possibly conveyed. Because really it can't, right? Because the chemicals in your head are different than the chemicals in my head. And just because you're making sounds with your vocal cords that I pick up in my ear, those are just the sounds, right? Those are just chemicals. It's just air vibrating, sound waves, chords. The question is not the physicality, but the meaning, right, of these events. How is meaning conveyed? And the guy said, because it's just a transferal of information. So in other words, he's assuming that the information is what explains the meaning, right? The meaning is conveyed in, quote, information. So in other words, he's saying, because the meaning is conveyed in the conveyal of the meaning. Information equals meaning, and information is conveyed, and that's how you explain the meaning. That's called a circular argument. Now, in the context of specific examples of, a debate. We're debating abortion, and somebody says, "Oh, abortion is wrong because it's morally atrocious." Now, I am against abortion, obviously, but that is a fallacious argument because it begs the question, right? The question is, why is it wrong? And for you to say, because it's something evil that I don't like, equates to saying that you think it's wrong. So saying that abortion is wrong because it's wrong, in this case, is a circular argument, and it begs the question, and that's not a valid argument. Now, at the fundamental worldview level, however, it's not possible to avoid circularity. And not just at the fundamental worldview level, but in other examples like Gödel's incompleteness theorem, it ultimately becomes circular, right? If you ask me the question, how do words mean? I cannot explain how words mean without using words that mean. So in linguistic philosophy, in mathematics, in terms of paradigms of belief and worldviews, at a certain level, you can't avoid circularity. And this is where coherence theory of epistemology comes in. So that's different, though, than in the midst of a debate in terms of particular examples of the fallacy of begging the question. Two different things. Very important to distinguish that, because sometimes people get confused, right? So if I said something like, yes, ultimately the argument for God's existence at its most fundamental level in my paradigm is circular because I can't get any more fundamental in my worldview than God. Somebody says, "Oh, that's circular." And I'm saying, well, yes, it is, because that's at the level where there's no way to avoid circularity. In the same way, if you were a metaphysical naturalist, materialist, and you question them down to the level of naturalism, for them, materialism, it has the same function as God. It's just a self-evident circular principle. Well, we just know that that's what's true, because it just is. So in other words, every position ultimately will fall into a kind of circularity. It's unavoidable. And that's why we compare paradigms or worldviews. Appeal to authority. Now, this one happens a lot in informal conversations. It also happens in debates a lot too, but it's not always, as we said, it's not always wrong to give a testament from a witness, right, or an expert witness. This happens in court cases. That is not a fallacy. To use evidence from an expert to help propel your case, to make a case, is not the same thing as appeal to authority. So if I say, I have a lot of, that's why I was giving examples in the first couple hours of mathematicians, Roger Penrose, Gödel, others, who through their lifetime of studying mathematics and making inventive breakthroughs and discoveries are convinced that mathematics is not physical. It goes beyond and transcends the physical. That's not an appeal to authority, because I'm not resting my argument solely on the fact that Gödel or Penrose says that. Those are testaments or witnesses. If I were to say that we know that mathematics transcends physicality because Roger Penrose said so, that would be an appeal to authority, and that is a fallacy. And that's because authorities are not always right. But just because authorities are not always right doesn't mean you can't still utilize the testimony of authorities. And that's, again, a very sophomoric, freshman level mistake that people make in terms of logic. Appeal to natural. This is interesting. This is one that is pretty common with atheist materialists, and they will say that, well, it's only natural that XYZ happens. Right? This is a fallacy, because it's not exactly clear what we mean by nature or what is natural, and quite often what is natural has been in dispute and been debated. Now, I'm not saying that we can't talk about what's natural. I think that when we ask this kind of question, it's ultimately going to be determined by our worldview. If I'm a metaphysical materialist, then I think that anything that occurs is natural, right? And JF makes this point. That is correct. Anything that occurs is natural because all things are part of natural process. So for him, there's nothing wrong with transhumanism. There's nothing wrong with homosexuality or anything, because anything that occurs is part of determined naturalistic process. So in his worldview, what is natural is very different from our worldview as to what is natural. For us, it is unnatural to engage in homosexuality. It is unnatural to engage in genetic modification. It is unnatural to engage in bestiality. Right? These are actions that go against nature. So you can't just appeal to nature as if nature itself weren't a concept that was determined by one's paradigm. This is common amongst Thomists, followers of Thomas Aquinas, and Roman Catholics, who assume that there's such a thing as natural theology, and that nature teaches us some common generic idea about the essence of God, and it doesn't. Composition division. This is a good one. It doesn't happen a lot, but every now and then it pops up. I like this guy's example. It says this is the part whole fallacy. In other words, that something that's true of the parts is not necessarily true of the whole. So, for example, if I say, well, cars have cars have oil in them, and so therefore, no, that's not a good example. What am I trying to say? What's something that's true of a part of a car that somebody could say is true? Cars have glass windows, and windows are a big part of a car, and so therefore cars are made of glass. Right? That would be a stupid version of a fallacy, but we can't reason just because cars have windows. It doesn't follow that the cars as a whole, and even because we spend most of our time looking out the windows in the car, it doesn't follow that the car is a window. This example is better. It says, Daniel was a precocious child, and he had a liking for logic. He reasoned that since atoms are invisible, and that since he was made up of atoms, that he too was invisible. That's actually a really good example of it. What is true of the part is not always necessarily true of the whole. Anecdotal fallacy, using a personal experience or an isolated example instead of a valid argument, especially used to dismiss statistics. That's true. That is when this is false. Now, there's nothing wrong with necessarily giving an existential account or a personal example or an anecdote, but they're not valid arguments. So, for example, if someone were to say, how do we know God exists? And I said, I prayed a prayer and I felt better afterwards, and it changed my mind, it changed my heart, so therefore God exists. Now, it may be true that God changed your heart, right? And you came to believe in God. But the feeling that you had, or the existential experience or whatever, in itself is not a objectively valid argument. Because, for example, a person could say the same thing about any religion. A person could say, I went to the ashram and I had a moving experience, and therefore I know that Osho's Hindu cult type thing is true. There are Buddhists who, set themselves on fire to free Tibet or whatever, Tibetan Buddhists, supposedly, right, in their protests. That doesn't prove Buddhism. Right? So your personal account of something, it has no objective proof quality to it. It might be useful. It might be worth recounting in certain contexts, but strictly speaking, it's not a proof because we don't have access to, we don't know how sincere you were, what exactly caused this experience that you had, why you had it, whether it really was or wasn't God. We just don't know. So it's not a valid, objective form of argumentation. Again, that's not to say that you can't talk about your own personal experiences or that they're not relevant, but in the domain of formal debates, they don't really count. Texas sharpshooter. This is common in the conspiracy world. And so this is a very important one to point out because I see it a lot in conspiracy discourse. I see this in, well, let's see what they say. Cherry picking data clusters to prove the argument, or finding a pattern to fit a presumption. Right. So in other words, the last two school shootings or major shooting events, I found evidence of two guys. I'm just saying this is a hypothetical. I found evidence of two guys who were, this is a hypothetical situation. Okay, I'm not applying this to a specific case, so don't try to go after me on this. Let's say hypothetically that this year there were only two major shooting events, and we found evidence of two people in both events who were crisis actors. And then therefore, for the rest of the year, I say all shooting events, right, are completely done by crisis actors. Even like gang shootings in Chicago. Oh, that's crisis actors. That would not be a valid argument, and that would be the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. Again, not to say that the first or second shooting events that we started with were real. Maybe they were completely fake. Maybe they were all crisis actors. But you can't infallibly extrapolate that every single event after that, that you class into a category of, quote, shooting events, that they are all necessarily fake. Now, they may be, but you can't prove that they necessarily are just because the ones in the past were. And this kind of gets back to Hume's question of induction. And you'll see this too. You'll see Texas sharpshooter with like flat Earth, for example. So flat Earth will say, look, here's an example where NASA lied. Here's another example where NASA lied. I've got 3 examples now of NASA lying and doing composite pictures. Therefore, there's no such thing as, any kind of rocketry. There is no aerospace technology, whatever. You could extend this to what it says. So therefore, everything in NASA is fake. So NASA lies 1, 2, 3 times, so therefore everything from NASA is fake, and therefore the Earth is flat. Well, you went into this with the presupposition that the Earth was flat, and you're saying that because of the times that NASA lied that you have examples of, that therefore everything from NASA is false, and that there's not any of these technologies. So you're extrapolating all these conclusions that don't follow from, the specific examples of NASA lying. Maybe NASA is continuing to lie, but it doesn't follow that the Earth is flat from NASA lying. No true Scotsman, making what could be called an appeal to purity as a way to dismiss irrelevant criticisms or flaws of an argument. This comes up sometimes with Dawkinites or the kind of neo-Darwinian proponents, atheists. They'll say things like, no true scientist looks at design or considers intelligent design or would even countenance some kind of creation argument. Well, the question is excluding evidence from the outset by trying to define what a, quote, true scientist is, right? And that's what's in question. The very thing that's in question, you can't exclude it by saying that I'm not going to accept that evidence, right? So this is a version of what I've sometimes called, what Dr. Bonson called, the crackers in the pantry fallacy, right? It's a way to set up from the outset what kinds of evidence and argument will be acceptable, and it's a way to from the outset kind of disarm the opponent from having any argumentation. But if the opponent knows when you're doing the no true Scotsman, he can point it out and say, sorry, that's a fallacy. You can't from the outset say what a true scientist is, in order to cut off and delineate, no examples of, God's existence from mathematics or logic, because you don't accept immaterial things, right? So kind of a version of this when I was explaining how different things are proven in different ways, right? If we want to prove the existence of something immaterial and we're saying that it's immaterial, then the opponent can't say, well, I will only accept physical evidence of something immaterial. That doesn't make any sense. Right? So they're excluding from the outset even the possibility of proving the kind of thing that you're talking about. Burden of proof. This one is a little fuzzy because it's not always clear. People will actually misuse this one a lot, because not every time that you make a claim is the burden of proof on you. It depends on actually what the claim is, right? So in other words, I might make a claim that implies a negation. And if my claim implies or is a negation, then the burden of proof isn't necessarily always on me. So this is another one of those freshman, sophomore level mistakes that people make, where they'll say in debates, things like, well, you made the claim, the burden of proof is on you. Not necessarily. It depends on what the claim is. Let's see what their example is. Saying that the burden of proof lies not with the person making the claim. Yeah, so they're kind of having a basic bitch approach to this. Let's see what their example is. Bertrand declares that the teapot is, at this very moment, in orbit around the sun between the Earth and Mars. And because no one can prove him wrong, his claim is therefore valid. Yeah, that's a good one. This is an extraordinary claim. He offers no proof, and he's therefore sort of trying to weasel around it by saying that, well, the burden of proof is on everybody else. Sometimes this is misused, though, where you have somebody say, make an extraordinary claim that God exists, and therefore the burden of proof is on you. Well, now, wait a minute. From when we're, again, debating things at the paradigm level, I'm so tired of that guy. I can't stand it when he does that. If we're debating things at the paradigm level, God's existence may or may not be extraordinary. If God does exist, then it's not an extraordinary claim. So in other words, it really depends on the paradigm as a whole determining what kinds of things are or are not extraordinary claims. So for example, you might extend that out to saying that if I say you believe in something immaterial, well, that's an extraordinary claim. The burden of proof is on you. And if in this case we're talking about something like numbers or the laws of logic, is it really extraordinary to think that numbers and laws of logic are immaterial? Is it extraordinary to consider them having existence? What I'm saying is that there's a presupposition already built into the question of what an extraordinary claim is, and that's not always clear. So therefore, burden of proof isn't always used in the right way. Tu quoque. This is a good one. Avoiding having to engage criticism by turning it back on the accuser, answering a criticism with a criticism. Now, this happens a lot in debates. I don't think because people are intentionally trying to be deceptive, but rather because debates get heated and emotional, and you kind of speak on the fly, and you just kind of say, what comes into your mind. Maybe you're on the defensive in the debate, and you're replying by saying, well, but you never did answer my criticism earlier. So this happens a lot in debates. Sometimes this one's a little fuzzy too, because once again, it depends on the kind of thing that we're debating. So for example, if I'm making a transcendental argument, I would say that the case is unique and it's not a tu quoque. Sometimes people say you can't do a transcendental argument because it's tu quoque. It's actually responding with a criticism of the opponent's presuppositions or paradigms. That's true, but at the paradigm level, just like we saw with circularity, that's unavoidable. So if I'm making an argument from the impossibility of the contrary, or a reductio argument, if I'm making a reductio argument, I can't avoid a tu quoque, right? So sometimes these get a little hairy and a little fuzzy. So, we can't be freshman, sophomore logic people. We have to recognize that there's a little bit of nuance even in the laws of logic. Appeal to emotion. However, though, I should say that in most of the time, people aren't debating transcendental categories. Most of the time, people aren't debating something fundamental at the paradigm level. So, in most debates, tu quoque is a fallacy. Let me give you an example. So, if I said your position on abortion is refuted because we now know that life begins at conception because of peer-reviewed. This is just hypothetical. Peer-reviewed research has shown sonographs, different types of graphs have shown that the heart is beating, the child makes noises consonant with desiring food, and the mind of the child is at work, and he is alive in the womb, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and then the opponent says, well, your position is based around hating women's free choice and bombing abortion clinics. That would be a tu quoque, because the opponent is not actually dealing with the claim or the evidence related to, the evidence based around the baby in the womb. They're just responding by criticizing back and saying that, implying that or stating that pro-life people just bomb clinics or something like this. That would be a valid violation of tu quoque. Appeal to emotion. This one is super common. This is the kind of thing that you get in advertising, the kind of thing that you get in, daytime TV, talk shows, leftist SJWs, Hollywood. They love appeal to emotion. This is a classic one. I remember Jesse Ventura one time was on some show. I don't know if it was like Larry King, CNN, or Alex Jones or something years ago. And somehow the topic of God came up, and Jesse Ventura said something like, well, you know why I don't believe in God is because I don't need a crutch. I'm not a weak person. The implication being that appealing to the emotion of the audience, who obviously would not want to be considered weak, right? Nobody wants to be considered weak. Well, I don't want to be considered weak, so yeah, I don't believe in a God as a crutch, right? That's not a valid argument. That is an appeal to emotion. Children, images of children, Syrian boy, or, they threw the babies out of incubators, Saddam Hussein, right? Gaddafi, who was killing kids or some crap like that. That is an appeal to emotion. So that really has nothing to do with whether the war was justified, whether the war was morally atrocious, et cetera, et cetera. Using these kinds of things is an appeal to, again, very common in advertising. And it's common in advertising because this is the kind of thing that motivates women. I'm not being offensive here. I'm not saying that women do not have logic or reason, but they have more of an influence through their emotions. They can be more influenced through appeals to emotion. And that's why political ads is a great example of this. It's like Mitt Romney doesn't care about women. In fact, Mitt Romney voted to hate women or something like, the typical political ad is just supercharged with the fallacy of appeal to emotion. That's a great example. Fallacy. This is a great one. And this is a clever one because it kind of slips beneath your radar. You don't notice this one. But when it's pointed out, you start to realize, oh, yeah, I see that one. That happens quite a bit, actually. And this is presuming a claim to be necessarily wrong because a fallacy was committed. The low-hanging fruit, right? This is like the atheist position is true. right? Because I've seen them argue with a bunch of damn retard Christians who make bad arguments, right? Well, the bad argumentation of Christian XYZ, just as much as the bad argumentation of atheist XYZ, really has nothing to do with whether those positions are true or false. If here's a great example, Kirk Cameron. I'm going to give an example both ways. Kirk Cameron did that stupid thing where he said that because a banana fits in a person's hand and in the mouth, that it was designed by God to be eaten, and therefore God exists. Okay, and then a million zillion atheists jumped on this as the dumbest argument ever. And that is a dumb argument. Okay, that's a super dumb fallacy argument. Terrible, terrible argument. But that doesn't disprove Christianity, because Kirk Cameron did a terribly stupid argument with a banana. There's a guy who makes these, I forget his channel's name, but he was on Facebook. It's like the I Love Jesus channel or something ridiculous. This guy who makes these videos in his car, he's absolutely the worst apologist ever. And he's like, yelling from his car about how you're dumb if you're an atheist because he prayed the prayer and he knows God exists. And his videos get like 1 million views. It's awful. But, a million atheists jump on that. Very easy, low-hanging fruit. They refute it. There. Debate 1, I've ended Christianity. I've ended all philosophical, theological debate because of Kirk Cameron and the fat Facebook bearded guy's car videos. In the same way, when atheists respond with their bad arguments, that doesn't mean that I've proven theism, right? If let's see, so TJ Kirk, when I think this is the case. I don't follow this stuff, but this is the way it was explained to me, because I was supposed to debate that dude, which never happened. But that's how the JF debate happened. But anyway, so when TJ Kirk, Amazing Atheist, responded to Kirk Cameron, TJ Hooker, Kirk Cameron. When TJ responded to Kirk Cameron, he put the banana in his butt, supposedly. I haven't watched this. I have no interest in seeing this gross-looking, Jeremiah Bannister-looking dude putting a banana in his butt. And his argument was, well, hey, look, the banana fits in my butt, therefore bananas are proof that God is for homosexuality. That is just as bad and dumb an argument. It's not even an argument, right? But he and like a bunch of low IQ YouTube atheist people thought that he had like destroyed Christianity and Kirk Cameron. And actually, both of those are the dumbest things imaginable. So those are great examples of the fallacy. Okay, moving on here. We're getting towards the end of this. Personal incredulity, saying that because one finds something difficult to understand is therefore not true. Yeah, this is a good one. There was a guy on Hoaxbusters, I forget his name, but he was like, you make arguments about, how did he put it? You make arguments to try to prove abstract objects exist, and you do a bunch of word salad and it's confusing, and so therefore you're a huckster and you're a con man. And I don't believe your argument's no good because it's confusing or it's complex. Well, complexity really has nothing to do with whether it's true or false. I mean, true, it could be that I'm engaging in word salad, but that's not an argument to say that because what I'm talking about you don't understand it or it's difficult. That doesn't prove or disprove the thing. It could be true, it might not be true, but something being complex. To say that it's false is to assume from the outset that the only things that are true in reality are things that are simple. And that's not the case. Very complex equations go into building a computer or a rocket or something, advanced like that. Something technologically advanced is very complex. Well, I mean, are you going to deny the Apple doesn't exist. It's a scam. It's fake because there's no such thing as, like advanced technology. Come on, that's stupid. So that's a good example of personal incredulity. Ambiguity. Let's see what they say. Using double meanings or ambiguities of language to mislead or misinterpret the truth. When the judge, this one's a little confusing because basically, I mean, their example is confusing, so I'm not going to use their example, but a better example of ambiguity would just be unclear terms. This is kind of close to the nature fallacy a minute ago, that we're assuming what it is to be a scientist, no true Scotsman, right? A pure true scientist would never listen to this kind of argument. And the fallacy of nature that, it's only natural to, engage in homosexuality, because the same people who don't believe that it's natural will say, well, it's only natural to avoid homosexuality. Right. So what is natural is going to be determined by your paradigm. And really that kind of just goes extending out to other examples with ambiguity. So, for example, a lot of times you'll hear people in debates or conversations say, well, the only rational position is XYZ. Well, now, wait a minute. I mean, rational, you think that this is clear, but actually in the history of philosophy or in epistemology, it's not exactly clear what it is to be rational. There's a lot of debate around this. Now, I'm not saying that we have no idea of what rationality is, but, rationality is going to be determined by your paradigm. I mean, one person thinks that it's rational to, for example, exterminate a large portion of the population. I mean, the globalists believe that's rational. If you are a Christian, you believe that that's not rational. It's unnatural and it's a sin. So what is reasonable, right? In my worldview, I think it's very reasonable. It's the only reasonable position to posit that numbers and mathematical concepts have an independent existence from the mind. For JF, that is not rational, right? So we can't just assume that terms like what it is to be reasonable or what it is to be rational are always clear. Those can at times be very ambiguous, debatable terms. So don't let somebody pull the sleight of hand trick on you and say, well, it's only rational that we do X, Y, Z. Well, now, wait a minute. What do you mean? Why do you think that's the only rational option? Et cetera, et cetera. Genetic fallacy. This is very similar to the other fallacy of false cause that we saw earlier. Let's see what their example is. Judging something to be good or bad on the basis of where it comes from or who it comes from. Yeah. Sometimes this blends into ad hominem too, well, we know that we can't, and I'm not arguing either way on this. I'm just using an example. We can't listen to the founding fathers because they were white male slave owners, right? So everything that the founding fathers discussed or debated or talked about is immediately discounted because they were slave owners. That would be an example of genetic fallacy. In other words, examining the validity of, say, the Constitution and making arguments about the Constitution. I'm not making an argument for the Constitution, by the way, but I'm saying that if a person were debating the Constitution and they said, I was actually just listening to a debate with a guy saying this. He was saying to a alt-right person, the Constitution, why should we debate that? They had slaves. Okay, that's a fallacy. It's genetic fallacy. Okay, and I don't care about the Constitution. Actually, I think it's kind of silly. Constitutional republics, I think, are kind of silly. But that is just one example of the fallacy. You can't judge something to be good or bad or true or false just because of where it comes from. Even if it comes from there was a meme like a year ago that was pretty good on this. It was like, Trump drinks water, Hitler drinks water, Trump and Hitler have the same ideology or something like that. The idea being that Trump is drinking water because Hitler drank water, right? Really stupid. Middle ground, saying that a compromise or a middle point between two extremes must be the truth. Oh yeah, this is a great one because you can't really say something is the midway point. You'll see this a lot in political discourse where people try to say, oh, I'm a centrist. That's the most rational position because, it's Aristotle's golden mean between two extremes and blah, 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 blah. But actually saying what the middle ground is already presupposes that you know which positions are the extremes, right? And if you're debating what's true or false or which positions are extreme or are not, it doesn't actually work to just say, well, mine's the middle ground. Well, is it? Let's see what their example is. Oh, here they give a vaccination example. We're not going to use their example. Bullshit. Because they're trying to actually make a pro-vaccination example. See whoever did this, like their presuppositions about like whether mass vaccinations were good, went into concocting this list. So that is a great list. Terrible examples, but a great list of, from their vantage point, that's why I gave my own, of the major informal fallacies. Now, in the debate with atheists, with the naturalists, with the Darwinists, the most common ones are fallacy, right? Oh, you're one of those Christian dorks that believes that like bananas are designed to fit in our hand, in our mouth. No, that was the bad Kirk Cameron argument, and that would be the fallacy. If you think that proves atheism or Darwinism because of Kirk Cameron's bad argument, you are engaging in the fallacy. Most common with the naturalists and the atheists is the appeal to nature, right? It's only natural that we accept the naturalist view of the world. It's only natural that we allow people to change their gender. It's only natural that we allow homosexuality because homosexuality is natural. Appeal to nature, fallacy. Tu quoque, answering criticism with criticism. I think at one point, when JF started trying to talk about priests and molesting kids in the debate, that had nothing to do with any argument that I ever made. So I think he was getting a little flustered at that point towards the end. And, like the Kokesh debate, if you remember, Kokesh did the exact same thing where he tried to pull the kind of like, well, your religion has evil people in it. I mean, come on, that's a fallacy, dude. Like I could turn right around and say how many atheists, murdered people in the 20th century. Come on. But that's actually, you can make that point, but it's not actually a valid argument to prove or disprove the position. Unless that's the thing that's under debate itself, right? So those bandwagon, I would say these are the most common that atheists do, right? Or the naturalist, evolutionary materialist. Bandwagon is also a fallacy. Well, all the scientists have proven evolution. Right? We all know evolution is true. 23 top scientists from the Royal Society believe in evolution. So what? 80% of college professors believe in evolution. So what? By the way, I don't actually know that 80% of college professors do, but let's just say for the sake of argument that it was. Well, it has nothing to do with whether evolution is true or false. So those are the most common when you're arguing with the atheist, naturalist, materialist, in my experience. And I've had probably, at least 100 debates with atheists, right? With the JF type of worldview. Those are the ones that I tend to see popping up. Now, in common discourse, when it's not in an academic type of debate setting, in common discourse, the most relevant will be ad hominem. I mean, this is the one that comes up all the time. This is the one where people are attacking you, your person, your character. And if you're making a point, if you're trying to argue something out, if you're trying to objectively demonstrate something, them attacking your character has absolutely nothing to do with your objective argument. So ad hominem and straw men is probably going to be in normal daily discourse the most common things that you experience. Like I said, talking head stuff. Like Tucker Carlson. Watch maybe a couple Tucker Carlson videos where he's got idiot liberals and SJWs on. It's not that Tucker Carlson is like a great logician, but usually in those videos, if you pay attention, what happens is, and he doesn't like name the fallacies, but he will actually give counter examples that show that what the person's saying is a fallacy. That's probably one of the best examples I could think of off the top of my head. Maybe I'll actually play, I don't know, a Tucker Carlson video or something and dissect and show where he is he's probably has some law school training. I don't remember what his background is, but he, even though he's not naming the fallacies, he's doing what I'm telling you about here. He's like looking at what they're saying and leading it out to its logical conclusion. So let's actually, I think that one where the woman was trying to have the word man banned or something ridiculous like this. Her examples were just total fallacies. And he was actually doing a good test case of like leading it out to its logical conclusion and doing a reductio. He's reducing her position to absurdity. Tucker's very good at that. And that's a great way to actually end your debate very quickly. And that's what I tried to do with JF. I think most people think I was successful in that regard, was to reduce his position to absurdity. So maybe let's look at a couple examples of how these apply in somewhat daily discourse. All right, and as I said, we're going to play this clip. It's very obvious, the fallacies that this woman's going to use. And as we said, Tucker Carlson will not specifically list the fallacies, but what he's going to do is take her positions to their logical conclusions and use a reductio argument, reducing the opponent's position to absurdity, to win this debate. Now, the woman here was too stupid to know that she lost the debate. She probably thought it was just a tie or something, or that she made good points. But no, she's very easily was destroyed. And again, this is a very common type of thing, but the reason that I'm doing a Tucker Carlson video is because most people that you meet are not JF. Most people that you meet are not going to be arguing Gödel's incompleteness theorem. They don't know what that is. They're going to be arguing like this woman, this very stupid woman. And they're going to be engaging in very ridiculous fallacies to actually enforce their agenda. So this is going to be a lot more practical and useful, I think, for most of the people in the audience in what they're going to encounter than, the more abstract kind of debate that I had with JF. So let's see how, and again, I'm not doing this to support Tucker Carlson and everything he says. It's just an example. That's all it is. But it's a good example of the kind of people that you do meet, unfortunately. So let's look at how he manhandles the woman who says we need to ban the word man.
A writing guide at Purdue University, accredited school, apparently, tells students to avoid words like mailman and mankind in order to have, quote, non-sexist, non-biased writing. Kathy Aru is founder and publisher of Catalina Magazine, and we think she agrees. And she joins us tonight. Kathy, it's great to see you.
Hi, good to see you.
I got to say, there's kind of a basic irony here. I mean, you're lecturing us about sexism while you're sitting right now in Manhattan.
Manhattan. We need to rename the city then. The Big Apple. The Big Apple would be less offensive. So I feel that I'm sitting in the Big Apple, not Manhattan.
Okay, but why stop there? Why should the post office deliver mail?
Now, this is ironic because the first thing that this woman does is try to equate. She does equivocation, which is the idea that words always mean the exact same thing in all contexts. And equivocation is a fallacy, an error of reasoning that wasn't in the list, but it is one, right? So that list wasn't comprehensive, by the way. There's other types of fallacies. Equivocation is, again, it might be classed under ambiguity, but it's the idea that a word always means the same thing. And what Tucker does is he cleverly slips in an example where it's the same phonetic sounds, but a different word. And this woman has absolutely no sense of nuance or differentiation. She's the most one-dimensional, stupid person I think I've ever heard in an interview. She doesn't even understand that the word male, M-I-L, is different from the word male, M-A-L-E. And in fact, Manhattan has nothing to do with the masculine or male half of the species.
I know. Well, it's spelled M-A-I-L, so that's okay. If it's M-A-L-E, then there's a problem.
Homonyms count, and this applies to email too, because it's not about spelling, it's about being gender inclusive. Right. And male is offensive. We just learned that. So.
Well, no, I don't think they're including that, but they are saying that society has changed and times are changing, and we don't want to.
Okay, I take that back. So she actually does correct it and say, "Oh, it's not homonyms. It's only the anything with the word male." However, M-A-L-E, but Manhattan has nothing to do with the masculine, right, or male gender.
Offensive in our language, and they're trying to be non-sexist and non-biased, and that means trying to take the word man out. So instead of man-made, it would be synthetic. So instead of male-man, it would be male-carrier. So there's many ways to go around it. Instead of humanity, you should say people.
But male carrier still has male in it. So you haven't, it's kind of a fake, but that's a Dodge.
So package carrier. Well, we can come up with so many other terms that are less offensive. Yeah.
You might still offend dyslexics. You can change a vowel, but it sounds the same. It has that dreaded word that sends people shrieking for their safe spaces, male.
Well, they're saying man. Man is the word that they're trying to avoid.
Now... This is so confused and stupid, it's almost difficult to dissect. But at first her argument was that because something is offensive, it needs to be banned. Now, there's a million different ways to construct this, but the first thing I would have done is to say, why do you think that this is wrong? Why do you think that because a tiny group of people claim that they're offended, that there's some rationale for banning whatever they want? And she actually will try to answer that question later on in this clip, but just the utter absurdity of this again is almost too difficult to dissect, because it's almost not even engaging in fallacy. I mean, it is, but it's like a level of stupidity and denial of language and nuance that is kind of baffling to people. And I think that the baffling aspect of it is what's so hard for people to combat. Like, they can't believe that there are people that are convinced of this and are doing this on purpose. But I think that you have to understand that this is actually an attack on language, and there's an army of dupes like this woman who believe this, but there's also very intelligent people behind this kind of a thing that are doing it on purpose. They're doing it intentionally to destroy the language. And if you say, I don't believe that, what evidence do you have for that? Read Orwell. And I don't even think Orwell was that great. I think he might even have been a kind of disinformation agent. But regardless, he's somebody from the establishment who is showing you that, yes, the establishment behind the different movements actually wants to destroy and downgrade the language. I mean, this is why the BBC introduced Pigeon Speak, which is the bizarre Ebonics translation that you could do on the BBC, to where everything reads in black speak in a form of Ebonics. That is, and by the way, I think if I recall, Bertrand Russell even said that we need to destroy the language, bring it down to Pigeon Speak, or Esperanto. He says something very basic and retarded. That doesn't have nuance. He says, because when people do learn nuance, that's associated with intelligence. And when you don't have intelligence and you don't have nuance, you just have very basic sounds and symbols for things, very childlike. You can't make distinctions. You're limited. You boxed yourself in. And this woman is like the icon of what Bertrand Russell is talking about, of what Orwell was talking about. You know, in 1984, O'Brien talks about destroying language, talks about limiting language. Russell said, if we teach, he says, we're going to teach children that black is white. And then, O'Brien says, you're going to say that I'm holding up 4 fingers when I have 5 fingers up, not because just because I want you to and because I'm torturing you, but because I'm eventually going to make you believe that 4 equals 5. And that's what this woman exemplifies. She is the icon of everything that Bertrand Russell and Orwell's O'Brien are talking about.
Saying that the word man is associated with adult men as opposed to just humanity or humans. So they're trying to avoid the word man. So if we can eliminate that word, then things would be much better and people would be less offended.
Well, what if you lived in Manchester, Vermont?
Well, they might have to change the name of the city if people agree with Purdue University. And Purdue University found that things need to be updated, and they updated.
So names of cities are going to have to be renamed because of what Purdue University says in their writing guide. By the way, why are you sending your children to these kinds of institutions? Why would you do that? You are a fool if you're doing that. So what they want to do is have expert rule, and this is what Quigley talked about. They want to have experts, just like O'Brien in 1984, just like Quigley talked about, telling everyone what is and is not reality, telling people you must rename your city. It's beyond the French revolutionaries, and the French revolutionaries tried to do similar things with getting rid of the religious calendar, getting rid of holidays, introducing a new calendar that was secular and Masonic. Bizarre, right? Just crazy, radical, ideologue, frothing at the mouth, irrational people. And this is what we are. We're 300 years at least now into the revolution since that time. And it's the same revolutionary ideology, just morphing and changing into different formats, right? Ultimately, yes, fire in the minds of men, Weishaupt, right? Communists, yes. And it's the bankers and the corporate elite behind all of this, right? So let's not be stupid here. Let's not be morons and call this a KGB conspiracy. No. The KGB is gone. They're not around, okay? The remnant of this is Gorbachev or something. Who does Gorbachev support? Corporate government. Because there's not a difference between corporate government and Soviet government. They're essentially the same thing.
Writing guide to take out these words that apparently are offending certain groups of people.
Okay, so just to make sure I understand the rule, if something offends somebody, even if you've never met that person personally,
right,
you have to change it. So doesn't that mean that a small group of super unhappy people get to control what the rest of us say and think?
Well,
so, yes, not only is this stupid on a practical level, it's completely. I don't even know what kind of fallacy. What is the fallacy when someone says anything that offends anyone should be banned? Wow. Anything that offends anyone should. I mean, it's so unworkable, so impossible that really, I guess the only fallacy I can get out of this is the reductio, right? That the position reduces to absurdity, because there's literally no way to ban everything that offends everyone. And we all know that this is not really about something that offends anyone. It's really about select groups that are weaponized and them being propelled to superstar, sanctified, new saint status because of being creeper weirdos. And I'm not joking about that. I'm saying trannies, I'm saying pedos, right? They're going to be the new sodomites, the new sanctified, holy, evil people. And this is actually a strategy where you the French revolutionaries did this, where they put at the top of society the worst of society. And what that did was it revolutionized society. then that's really what, Hollywood is here to do, what mass media is here to do, what the public education system is here to do, is indoctrinate in the exact same way. So ultimately, as I said, what Tucker's going to do is just keep kind of fleshing out her position to its logical ends, which is absurdity, which is one of the strongest ways to refute a position.
They're ahead of their time. Maybe this is something that is offending a small group, but the group's going to get larger, and times are changing, and our language is dynamic. Webster keeps adding new words in the dictionary.
So let's analyze this, because this is a fallacy that comes up often in evolution debates and relativistic type debates. This woman is a relativist, as are most people in modernity, as are most evolutionary proponents, atheists, etc. Not all. Every now and then you'll meet one that claims to not be and has concocted some argument where he thinks he can avoid it, but most are, 98%. And so her argument is that, well, things change. And since things change, since we're progressing, whatever that means, we're becoming more whatever. By the way, how do you know that we're not digressing? On what scale do you judge that we are progressing, or maybe we're digressing? How do we know? I mean, what is your scale here? Where did you derive your scale of value judgment in this case? Of course, this woman is not going to know that. She would never be able to answer that. That would be way too difficult for her puddle level depth of intelligence. But the point being that this is based in relativism. So what I would do at this point in the debate, this is a TV show, so he's probably not obviously going to delve into philosophy. The average Fox News boomer watcher doesn't know anything about philosophy, so that would be lost on them. But if this were in a more intimate or debate setting, I would say, well, how do you know that everything changes? Just because new words develop and are added to the dictionary, it does not mean that all language is in a process of evolutionary flux. Even liberal gatekeeper Chomsky realized that there are certain syntax and grammatical forms and phonetic structures that underlie all language. So not everything in language changes. So this is a fallacy. I'm making this new fallacy up. This is the fallacy of change, the evolutionary fallacy that everything changes. And I hear this all the time. People say this all the time. They're always saying, well, everything changes, man. Oh, well, is it true that the statement everything changes also changes? And if so, then it's refuted.
Our language needs to change, and a term that used to be non-offensive, like...
So what she just argued was that everything changes, this is offensive, our language needs to change. Now, what is her basis for saying that the language needs to change? She's saying because people are offended. And any time that somebody's offended, it needs to change. She's a little unclear on whether it needs to happen anytime. But in this case, she says the basis is because they have a sizable following. Bandwagon. So just because, by the way, they don't have a sizable following, she's being arbitrary in what a sizable following is. Sizable relative to what? But just because even if they had 99.9% of the population behind them, which please God don't let that ever happen. But even if they did have that is not a reason why something should change. That's called bandwagon fallacy. Just because a lot of people want something doesn't mean that it should happen or could happen or will happen. So she's committed a bunch of fallacies. There's not a basis for this position. She's just merely asserting it. And when Tucker asks her, she ends up using circular reasoning, bandwagon fallacy. Well, because it just needs to change. Why? Because things change.
Man-made and male-man now needs to be changed.
Well, I get that. I guess the question for me is who gets to decide what changes and what doesn't. So, for example, I think I've now decided that the most offensive word in the language is college professor.
In a way, he's asking about this is a good point too, is the authority fallacy. This woman earlier said, well, Purdue University said they need to. Oh, come on. That is the dumbest authority fallacy ever. on what basis should we accept the fact that, by the way, I guarantee it's not all of Purdue University. It's a 2 or 3, probably foundation connected, social justice, cultural Marxist professors at Purdue University that have concocted this scheme, right? So when she says Purdue University, that's who she's talking about. So why should they, right? On what basis do we accept their authority for this change? And she says, well, because they're Purdue University. Oh, well, because they have a decent sized following, she's eventually going to say. So what? That's a fallacy of authority, and that's the bandwagon fallacy. That's not a basis.
Oh.
Okay, because to me that connotes dumbness and misuse of power and tenure, right, and mediocrity. So maybe I'd like to say no one can use that word ever again in my presence because it offends me. Would that fly? Could I do that? Could I pull it off?
Well, if you have a writing guide, perhaps, and you put that out there and people agree with you, then yeah, maybe.
Yeah, so Tucker turned her argument around on her, and she doesn't even realize it. She doesn't even recognize how stupid she is, and that she just refuted herself because he used her own bases and said, oh, well, okay, so anything that is offensive needs to change. I'm offended by college professor, so that word needs to be banned. Her reply, to be consistent, well, if you get a writing guide and if you have enough people, then yes, you're right, maybe. And that's why Tucker's laughing, is because she just refuted herself. He just reductioed her.
That would fly. But Purdue University did find a group that agreed with them, and the university backed them up, and there you have it. They have a writing guide that now is going to teach us how to not offend.
So Purdue University produced a writing guide, and they got people to back them up, and now it's going to change. I mean, wow. This is why you need logic, okay? You don't want to be this woman. And this woman is what the public is being turned into. This woman is the university. This woman is the public academic type. Totally oblivious to her own stupidity, and at the same Dunning-Kruger effect, right? Not so stupid that she thinks she's intelligent, and not even, it's almost invincible ignorance to try to convince her or show her that she's an idiot. Look up Dunning-Kruger effect. It's very, very, I think it's true. Everything I've seen in my experience 100% vindicates that thesis. And the thesis is basically that not very intelligent people far overestimate their abilities and qualities because of this kind of paradoxical situation where because they're not intelligent, aren't even aware of the vast areas that they don't understand. And so conversely, there's an opposite effect where highly intelligent people underestimate their own capabilities because they are aware of how much they don't know. So it's a kind of a weird back and forth there between these two groups, but it's certainly been my experience in academia and in my life that low intelligence people vastly overestimate their intellectual capabilities, ironically, because they're dumb. Right? So they don't know, and probably won't ever know, how much they don't know.
I think they have the guts. I mean, it's one thing to bully the little rich kids who go to your school, because, like, what do they know? But do you think they have the guts?
This is the heart of America.
Yeah, no, of course. But I mean, if you're paying like $60,000 or whatever it is for like the fake diploma you get, and you're not working, obviously you have privilege by definition, no matter who's paying for it.
This was a brilliant little thing that this woman didn't get. I do appreciate what Tucker said here, which is that, now wait a minute, you're falling back on the decision of some university professors to do this banning of the word man. And he's saying, aren't they by definition privileged and probably, quote, white? So why if you think that the enemy, Miss Social Justice Warrior, is privileged white people, why are you submitting to the decision of privileged white people, right? And of course she's going to say, well, it's about, what's offensive to people or some crap like that.
So, but it's easy to boss them around. Do you think they would have the guts to go to old man Sachs in New York and say, change your name now or else?
They probably wouldn't shop there.
And here he even further showed her stupidity for one of the world's largest banks. She probably thought he meant Saks Fifth Avenue when he said Goldman Sachs. So this woman doesn't even know what Goldman Sachs is. Like, right? J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, the two top banks in the world, and she thinks you go shopping there. Yeah, we go shopping there for banana flavored Bernanke bucks or something. I mean, what would you get at Goldman Sachs? You get you get raped. You get your money stolen from you. You get Federal Reserve dollars back or something. What I don't know what else you get there, but no. So this woman has been eviscerated on multiple levels in this discussion, and she's oblivious. She doesn't even see that she's been eviscerated on multiple levels. So he's just kind of like a cat with its prey, kind of having fun with her at this point. But the Goldman Sachs was a great one there because she's like, yes, if it's in a person's name and it's M-A-N, and then yes.
Because
if they were shopping at Goldman Sachs, they might come up short because it's a bank.
Because the name man is adult male, and yeah, we need to change it. Like woman, has the word man in there, so just call us a person.
Uh-huh. So, Gold Person Sachs, would that be better?
I think so. I'm less offended, yes.
And by the way, what if you just, since the rule is if you spell it, and I'll stop with this because I know this is angels on the head of a pin at this point, but if you spelled man differently, like M-A-A, so it was male man, but M-A-A-N.
No, the profession, we know that the professions usually were male-dominated, and they've changed, so no.
So now it's not about the spelling and what the word signified. Now it's about the fact that professions were male-dominated. So now you see the basis for why this needs to happen has changed about 5 different times. So it's not, this is so far removed from not just the realm of debate, which this woman hasn't even walked in the building. She's not even anywhere near the auditorium. She's wandering around the ghetto on the other side of town. She's not even near the debate, right, which is happening in the auditorium. She's across town, wallowing in the ghetto of stupidity and in some meth lab. This woman is not even in the debate. But in terms of just even common sense, there's not a coherent thought even in this as to why this needs to happen. And the basis has changed about 5 different times. So now the basis is because something has been dominated by males, it's inherently flawed, tyrannical, and the words related to it need to change. Right? This is kind of like the story I've told several times of Angelina Jolie making a war on the color pink in her movies. I know it doesn't make sense. Don't ask me to make sense of it, but that's how these people think. These people think, it actually, if you notice, it's not just getting irrational. It's almost starting to become like a superstitious cult. That is the best way to explain this. That's where this stuff is going. It's becoming a superstitious cult where things have magical powers inherently, like the color pink or the word man, and that's the source of evil. Right? That's what needs to be destroyed. We're going to wage a war, an iconoclastic Gnostic war on letters, words, and colors. It's unbelievable. And so, how, even let's say you did get rid of the word man. What about Guy? Will Guy Ritchie need to change his name? Will Guy Pearce no longer get work in acting? What about Dude? Can we no longer watch Hey Dude on Nickelodeon? Can we no longer go to the Dude Ranch? What about duty, right? Do we still have a duty to do our work? When we go to the bathroom, can we call it duty? Or is that offensive because it has the phonetic sound dude in it, which sometimes signifies a male? I guarantee you this woman has no idea what to say to any of that.
Saying male, man, and spelling it differently, that doesn't apply. We're trying to say this profession now applies for men and women or persons, all people. No
Wait,
man
but isn't
needed.
there a
No
man?
man
Hold on. Isn't
needed.
there a man in the word woman?
Call me a person. I'd be less offended. No need for woman.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I thought about this a long time ago when I was in college, and this was starting to be discussed in college classes about gender pronouns. Even in my undergraduate days, I could see where this was going. And I was like, well, I'm actually taking German classes right now, and German has gender, right? Die, der, da, right? Die, der, da. There's that stupid German rap song. I should play that. Die, da, die, da, die, da. That it utilizes gender. So are all languages going to be changed? These people are utterly retarded. But they do pose somewhat of a danger because they hold the positions of authority and teaching where you send your kids. And if you know this and you send your kids to these schools, you have to consider yourself liable for that. So there we saw Tucker there brilliantly in a watchable way deconstructing her without actually using the terms and listing the fallacies, but just kind of leading her through to a reductio which annihilates her position.